The mainstream consensus is that the New Testament was written in a form of Koine Greek, which was the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean from the conquests of Alexander the Great until the evolution of Byzantine Greek, the Hellenistic Jewish world. The New Testament Gospels and Epistles were only part of a Hellenistic Jewish culture in the Roman Empire, where Alexandria had a larger Jewish population than Jerusalem, and Greek was spoken by more Jews than Hebrew. Other Jewish Hellenistic writings include those of Jason of Cyrene, Josephus, Philo, Demetrius the chronographer, Euphorlemus, Pseudo-Euphorlemus, Artapaneses of Alexandria, Claudius Malchus, Aristeas, Pseudo-Hecataeus, Thallus, and Justus of Tiberias, Pseudo-Philo. Many Old Testament pseudepigrapha and the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible itself. Background on Koine Greek. Whereas the classical Greek city-states used different dialects of Greek, a common standard, called Koine, developed gradually in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC as a consequence of the formation of larger political structures and a more intense cultural exchange in the Aegean area, or in other words the Hellenization of the empire of Alexander the Great. In the Greek Dark Ages and the Archaic period, Greek colonies were founded all over the Mediterranean basin. However, even though Greek goods were popular in the East, the cultural influence tended to work the other way around. Yet with the conquests of Alexander the Great and the subsequent establishment of Hellenistic kingdoms, Koine Greek became the dominant language in politics, culture and commerce in the Near East. During the following centuries, Rome conquered Greece and the Macedonian kingdoms piece for piece until, with the conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, she held all land around the Mediterranean. However, as Horace gently puts it, conquer Greece has conquered the brute victor and brought her arts into rustic Latium. Roman art and literature were calqued upon Hellenistic models. Koine Greek remained the dominant language in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, extending into the Byzantine Empire as Byzantine Greek. In the city of Rome, Koine Greek was in widespread use among ordinary people, and the elite spoke and wrote Greek as fluently as Latin. Jewish Koine Greek did not exist as a separate dialect, but some Jewish texts in Koine Greek show the influence of Aramaic in syntax and the influence of biblical background in vocabulary. Languages used in ancient Judea. After the Babylonian captivity, Aramaic replaced Biblical Hebrew as the everyday language in Palestine. The two languages were as similar as two Romance languages are two Germanic languages today. Thus, Biblical Hebrew, which was still used for religious purposes, was not totally unfamiliar, but still a somewhat strange norm that demanded a certain degree of training to be understood properly. After Alexander, Palestine was ruled by the Ptolemies and the Seleucids for almost 200 years. Jewish culture was heavily influenced by Hellenistic culture, and Koine Greek was used not only for international communication, but also as the first language of many Jews. This development was furthered by the fact that the largest Jewish community of the world lived in Ptolemaic Alexandria. Many of these diaspora Jews would have Greek as the first language, and first the Torah and then other Jewish scriptures were therefore translated into standard Koine Greek, i.e. the Septuagint. Currently 1,600 Jewish epitaphs are extant from ancient Palestine dating from 300 BC to 500 AD. Approximately 70% are in Greek, about 12% are in Latin, and only 18% are in Hebrew or Aramaic. In Jerusalem itself, about 40% of the Jewish inscriptions from the 1st century period are in Greek. We may assume that most Jewish Jerusalemites who saw the inscriptions in situ were able to read them. the language of the New Testament. Most biblical scholars adhere to the view that the Greek text of the New Testament is the original version. However, there does exist an alternative view which maintains that it is a translation from an Aramaic original, a position known as Peshitta primacy. Although this view has its adherents, the vast majority of scholars dispute this position, citing linguistic, historical, and textual inconsistencies. At any rate, since most of the texts are written by diaspora Jews such as Paul of Tarsus and his possibly Gentile companion, Luke, and to a large extent addressed directly to Christian communities in Greek-speaking cities, and since the style of the Greek is impeccable, a Greek original is more probable than a translation. Even Mark, whose Greek is heavily influenced by his Semitic substratum, seems to presuppose a non-Hebrew audience. Thus, he explains Jewish customs, and he translates Aramaic phrases into Greek. In the Aramaic Syriac version of the Bible, these translations are preserved, resulting in odd texts like Mark chapter 15 verse 34, Greek text, Kappa Alpha Tau Nu Alpha Tau Rho Beta Omicron Eta Sigma Epsilon Nu Eta Sigma Omicron Sigma Phi Omega Nu Mu Epsilon Gamma Alpha Lambda Epsilon Lambda Omega Iota Epsilon Lambda Omega Iota Lambda Epsilon Mu Alpha Sigma Alpha Beta Alpha I Theta Alpha Nu Iota Sigma Tau Iota Nu Mu Epsilon Theta Epsilon Rho Mu Eta Nu Epsilon Epsilon Omicron Mu Epsilon Nu Omicron Nu Theta Epsilon Omicron Sigma Mu Omicron Epsilon Theta Epsilon Omicron Sigma Mu Omicron Epsilon Sigma Tau Iota Gamma Kappa Alpha Tau Epsilon Lambda Iota Pi Epsilon Sigma Mu Epsilon. Syriac text. Ubatsa Syrian Q et Yesua BQALA Rama WEMARL LLMANA Sabachthani Diite LILILMANA Sabachthani. King James. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? In the Peshitta, Mark chapter 7 verse 34 does not contain the doubled-up meaning. Mark chapter 15 verse 34 has two versions of the same expression, the former in Jesus's spoken dialect, the latter in another dialect. Languages of Jesus. The languages spoken in Galilee and Judea during the 1st century include the Semitic, Aramaic and Hebrew languages as well as Greek, with Aramaic being the predominant language. Most scholars agree that during the early part of 1st century Aramaic was the mother tongue of virtually all natives of Galilee and Judea. Most scholars support the theory that Jesus spoke Aramaic and that he may have also spoken Hebrew and Greek. Stanley E. Porter concluded, the linguistic environment of Roman Palestine during the 1st century was much more complex, and allows for the possibility that Jesus himself may well have spoken Greek on occasion. Other views. Critics of the mainstream consensus in favor of Greek being the original language of the New Testament claim logical improbabilities in the Greek text compared to the Syriac Hebrew texts and vocabulary containing wordplay in the Syriac Hebrew New Testament text that parallels Hebraic wordplay. In the Old Testament,